talk about trauma, I like to do a comparison because one of the things I think we always do is compare. And even though we're not supposed to compare, we still compare because that's how we make sense of the world. And so many times we want our one student to be like the other students because this student is disruptive, this student is non-compliant, this student is disobedient, disrespectful, all the words we put on, and we just want that student to be just like the other kids. Why can't he just be okay? Why can't she be okay? And so we're going to use two of my favorite, most fictitious children that I can design. The first one is Andy. Andy is the student that comes in the classroom ready to learn. This is the student that is fun to have in the classroom. This is the student next year or next school year, when you go down and you look at your roster and you look at the kids coming into your building, you're like, yes, we have Andy. I got Andy in my class. This is awesome. But why is Andy the enjoyable student? And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this also from a developmental standpoint. And I'm going to draw a purple line down the stage here. How many of you all are with the younger kids, so you know who Harold is, right? So we're going to draw a developmental timeline. And Andy is the student that comes to school ready because of something that's happened in the past. And so we'll start Andy's timeline from and I will say this, from a neurological timeline. We're going to start at birth even. Because from birth, for the first 9 months of life, Andy has been in a womb of a mother who wants to be pregnant, a mother who is taking care of herself, is decreasing the stress in her life. And then Andy has this nice, easy birth. And then the first 2 or 3 years of life, Andy has consistent caregiving. Andy has this parent who is right there, or parents to engage and to love and take care of their physical needs. And then Andy goes through maybe some preschool years and then enters kindergarten and is ready. And then as Andy goes through the educational experience, even when times are tough, Andy goes back home and has someone to be able to depend on. There's predictability in Andy's life. There's certainty in Andy's life. Andy knows that things are going to be all right. Andy believes in people. And as Andy moves through this timeline and goes through high school, you know what Andy's looking? Andy's looking for the future. Andy wants to know, what am I going to be when I grow up? What am I going to do? And so there's this excitement of moving forward. And so that is the life of Andy, so that even though there are traumatic situations along the way, Andy's still okay because there's been people in the life of that child and that student have made things all right and has created, again, certainty, predictability, the whole idea that Andy knows I am okay and all is well, everything is always working out for me. Those types of phrases and understanding of what life looks like keeps Andy on this really nice, succinct path. But we're going to be talking about Billy, and Billy is just a boy or girl. I use two gender-neutral names. This is just to put a face to a child and to a student, so that we don't just be in this more laboratory experiment. We say, well, we have a neurotypical child and a non-neurotypical child. Like, these are children that we're working with. This is why I use the name Andy and Billy. And when I talk about then Billy's life, we're going to look at a very, very different developmental pathway. Now, if you are a high school teacher, a high school administrator, and I'm starting here at conception, it might seem a little odd. But what I want to do is create a deeper understanding of why your high schoolers are acting out, why they're not showing up for school, why they're smoking pot, why they're doing all these things to try to get their body systems back down. So much of it actually does start here. Now, you may not always know this information. And again, if we have the school counselors and social workers and therapists, you might be able to get a lot more if you do some home visits. But just to give you a broader perspective, let's start then also at conception for Billy. What we have to see is that 9 months in that womb, it might just even be a mother who's just stressed out at her job. But there's a lot of drug abuse in this world, and so if you have a mother then that is taking alcohol or drugs, you then have a baby that is basically baked in cortisol, which is the stress hormone. You have a brain then that is developing in an environment that is very, very different than Andy. How many of you all are seeing children come into our schools for the last 5 or 10 years that are way more intense? The difficulty of them is increased, the challenges of them increased, and raise your hand. And I think that this is where this is really starting. We live in the most stressful time of human history. A lot of young families do not have family support. There's the drug opioid crisis as well. And so now we have kids early on whose nervous systems are going to be very, very different from our Andes. And if you have a student then that just has a very difficult birth, that's a kid that comes into this world that says the world's not safe, because from the child's perspective, it's not feeling good. You know, this might be medically necessary and absolutely in the long term, but think about it always from the student's perspective and the child's perspective that says, these needles don't feel good, this hospital room is cold, this surgery is an insult to my body is flaring up. And so birth trauma, I've worked actually with a lot of Andy families who have Billies because of what happened early on in life. So always look at that as well. And then this is the child then that goes through maybe a lot of multiple moves, family situations that are crumbling apart, unpredictability, a lot of homelessness where that student may be going from one home to another home or living in the car. They don't know what's going to happen next. That's a sense of powerlessness. How many of you all have students who ask you all the time, what's happening next? What's happening next? And you say, we're going to do history next. And then they say, what's happening next? What's happening next? All of this, again, is that uncertainty. I don't know I'm going to be okay. And so Billy's life then continues in this pattern. Some kids, you know, everyone's going to be different. Maybe they had a good early childhood and things have been great, but then in middle school they got bullied for a couple years. And I have seen that completely turn some students from an Andy into a Billy. And then as Billy moves along this timeline, this future is scary. This future says, I don't know how to be an adult. I don't know how to adult. Apparently that's a new way you say it, right? I don't know how to do adult. And so, what does Billy want? Billy actually wants to go backwards. And so I see this often. Then you might have maybe a student that you've done a lot of work with, and things are going great. This is a Billy, and you think, great, this is Billy's senior year. Awesome. He's going to be ready, or she's going to be ready. And then all of a sudden, the senior year, what do? They collapse. Because you know why? That's perfectly logical. If I can just stay back a year, I don't have to go forwards. And so it's their way of saying, I'm not ready for the world. And so what we understand with our students is that chronologically, you might have a student who is 16 years old, but developmentally, how old is that student probably? Maybe 12 years old. And we want to look at then not just the chronological age for our students, but maybe also the developmental age, because that maturity has been interrupted all along the way. And so the ultimate question is this: why are Andy and Billy, two children who appear to be so similar on the surface, so drastically different at every level? And this is what I want us to see. It's the difference between these two is that traumatic piece.